The Seoul skyline was a blur of neon through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the falling snow turning the city into a silent, white tomb. I pressed my palm against the glass, my wedding ring feeling tight on my swollen, tired fingers. Behind me, the penthouse smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of the rain Jin-Wook had brought in with him. My lower back burned with that familiar, heavy ache that comes at 8 months, a constant reminder that I was no longer carrying just myself, but the future of the park bloodline. On the mahogany desk sat the gold-plated fountain pen I'd bought him when he finally took over the foundation. We had toasted to a legacy that would last generations. The nursery was already painted, the hand-carved crib waiting in the next room. That room should have felt like a beginning. Instead, the silence in the air felt like a closing door. "Kalisa, look at me." Jin-Wook's voice didn't carry its usual warmth. It was a command. I turned slowly, my hand instinctively moving to cradle the heavy weight of the baby. He stood there in the sharp charcoal overcoat I'd tailored for him, his tattooed hands, the ones that used to hold me with such reverence, now shoved deep into his pockets as if he couldn't bear to touch me. Beside him stood Seoul, her silhouette sleek and cold, wearing a smile that looked like a victory lap. "What is she doing here, Jin-Wook?" I asked, though my heart had already hit the floor. He didn't look at the crib. He didn't look at my stomach. He looked through me, his eyes as dead as the winter outside. "The foundation needs a face the elders can trust, Kalisa, a face that belongs here. I've reached the top and there's no room left for you." The words hung in the air, sharper than any mafia blade. "I'm not just leaving," he whispered, finally meeting my eyes with a chilling detachment. "I'm deleting you. You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry." Welcome. Before we continue, please hit that like button, subscribe, and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. The streetlights of Seoul flickered above me, casting long, jagged shadows across the slush-covered pavement. Each step felt like a betrayal by my own body. The heavy, rhythmic throb in my lower back intensified with the biting wind that whipped through my coat. I reached the corner of the block, my breath coming in ragged plumes of white, and stopped at a small, glowing ATM tucked into the side of a convenience store. It was a mundane little machine, but right now, it was my only lifeline. I fumbled with my wallet, my fingers so numb they felt like wooden blocks. I pulled out the sleek black titanium card, the one Jin-Wook had given me on our 3rd anniversary. "For the woman who keeps the world running," he had whispered back then. Now, as I slotted it into the machine, the mechanical whir sounded like a low growl. I punched in our anniversary date, the code that had unlocked everything for years. The screen didn't show my balance. It didn't offer me options. Instead, a cold, red box appeared, account restricted. Contact your administrator. A hollow laugh escaped my lips, turning into a shiver. I tried my personal savings card next, the one I'd kept since before the foundation became a billion-dollar ghost empire. The result was the same invalid transaction. My heart hammered against my ribs, nearly as hard as the baby was kicking. Jin-Wook hadn't just kicked me out of the penthouse. He had reached into the digital veins of my life and severed them. He knew my spending habits, my backup accounts, the very routing numbers I had encrypted for him. He was using my own brilliance to cage me in the cold. I leaned my forehead against the freezing plastic of the machine, the reality sinking in like lead. I was 8 months pregnant, standing in a snowstorm with exactly 01 to my name. Every Uber app, every food delivery service, every hotel booking, they were all tied to the digital identity he was currently dismantling. I looked down at my phone. The signal bars were there, but the service was flickering. He was probably calling the provider now, reporting the device stolen. I looked back toward the direction of the Foundation's headquarters. The glowing blue lights of the tower's crown mocked me from a distance. Up there, in the warmth, he was likely pouring a drink for Seoul, celebrating his purity and his new, uncomplicated future. To the world, I was being erased. To the elders, I was a footnote. To Jin-Wook, I was a bug in his system that he had finally patched out. I wrapped my arms around my belly, shielding my daughter from the wind that seemed to be hunting us. "It's okay," I whispered, though my voice trembled. "He thinks he revoked my access." I looked at the dark screen of the ATM one last time. He had blocked the cards, the accounts, and the names. But he had forgotten that he didn't build the system. I did. He had cut the branches, but I was the root. As a black sedan slowed down at the curb, its headlights cutting through the falling snow, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, simmering resolve. He wanted me to be a ghost? Fine. I would be the kind of ghost that haunts you until your entire empire turns to ash. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, mocking the thin fabric of my coat as I ducked into the recessed doorway of an all-night 24-hour laundromat. It was the only place left with a sliver of warmth and a public Wi-Fi signal that hadn't been scrubbed by Jin-Wook's security team. My phone buzzed in my hand, a dying, stuttering ghost of my former life. I didn't need to open the app to know what was waiting for me. The notifications were already bleeding across the lock screen like fresh wounds. I tapped the screen, the blue light reflecting off the dried salt of tears on my cheeks. There she was. Seoul had wasted no time. The image was curated to perfection, high resolution and glowing with the soft, amber warmth of the penthouse I had called home only 3 hours ago. She was standing on the glass-railed balcony, my favorite spot, where I used to watch the sunrise while dreaming of the life our daughter would have. She was wrapped in a plush, white cashmere throw that Jin-Wook had bought for me during our first winter together. In her hand was a crystal flute of vintage champagne, the bubbles rising in a slow, triumphant dance. The caption read, "Finally back where I belong, new beginnings. The foundation hash reclaimed true love." I watched as the likes ticked upward in a dizzying blur, thousands of people cheering for the thief who had stepped into a warm bed while the woman who built it was shivering in the dark. In the background of the photo, partially blurred but unmistakably there, was Jin-Wook. He was leaning against the doorframe, that same sharp charcoal overcoat draped over a chair, looking at her with the relaxed, easy gaze he used to reserve for me. Seeing her there, standing where I had felt the baby's first kicks, felt like a physical violation. She wasn't just taking my husband, she was colonizing my memories, replacing my presence with her polished, socially acceptable veneer. To the world, I was the mistake that had finally been corrected. I was the placeholder who had served her purpose and was now discarded like seasonal decor. My thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. I could see the comments scrolling by, associates of the foundation, people who had sat at my dinner table and praised my intellect, now leaving heart emojis for the new queen. They were celebrating my erasure. I leaned my head against the cold, vibrating side of a washing machine, the industrial hum a stark contrast to the elegant silence of the life I'd lost. Seoul thought she had won a kingdom. She thought that by standing on my balcony and wearing my cashmere, she had inherited my power. But as I looked at her smug, victorious smile, a new kind of heat began to rise in my chest, pushing back the frost of the Seoul night. She was celebrating a new beginning built on a foundation of sand. She didn't know that the very balcony she was standing on was wired into a network she couldn't comprehend. She saw a view, I saw data points. She saw a husband, I saw a liability I was finally ready to liquidate. I closed the app and deleted the history. Let her have the balcony for tonight. Let her drink the champagne. The higher she climbed into my old life, the further she would have to fall when I finally pulled the switch. I stood up, adjusting the weight of the baby, my eyes fixed on the black sedan still idling at the curb. The victory party was just starting for them, but for me, the real work was about to begin. The black sedan remained a silent sentinel at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh, fluorescent glow of the laundromat. As I stared at its dark frame, my mind drifted back. Retreating from the freezing Seoul night into the heat of the fires, I had spent 5 years putting out for Jin-Wook. He liked to tell the world he was a self-made titan, a man who conquered the underworld through sheer iron will, but the ghosts in the machines knew better. I remembered the night 3 years ago, when the Foundation's entire offshore network began to bleed. A rival family had deployed a logic bomb that was eating through our encryption like acid, threatening to expose every bribe, every shipment, and every silent partner to the authorities. Jin-Wook had stood in the center of his war room, screaming at his high-priced security team while they stared helplessly at screens scrolling with red error codes. He was panicking, a king watching his throne dissolve into binary. I had slipped into the back of the room with a tray of coffee, looking like the dutiful, invisible wife they expected me to be. While the men shouted, I had placed my tablet behind a stack of files and remotely bypassed the primary server. I didn't just stop the bleed. I rerouted the attack, tracing it back to the source and draining the rivals' own slush funds before they even knew I was there. By the time I left the room, the screens had turned green. Jin-Wook took the credit, puffing out his chest as he told the elders he had handled it. I had just smiled and wiped the coffee rings off his desk. Then there was the night in Busan, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Jin-Wook was walking into a trap, a peace summit that was actually an execution. I was the one who had intercepted the encrypted burner phone signals from the docks. He had told me to stay at the hotel, to leave the business to the men. But I had stayed awake until dawn, hacking into the city's traffic surveillance grid. I saw the snipers positioning themselves before his motorcade even turned the corner. I couldn't call him. The line was jammed. So I manually triggered the fire suppression systems and the emergency alarms in the building next to him, creating a chaotic diversion that forced his security team to pivot and flee seconds before the first shot was fired. He came home that night shaking, boasting about his mafia intuition that had told him something was wrong. I had simply unbuttoned his shirt and cleaned a scrape on his shoulder, never mentioning that I was the one who had pulled the strings of the city to keep him breathing. I had been his shadow architect, the invisible hand that stabilized his world every time it threatened to tilt into chaos. I had let him believe he was the sun so that he would shine brighter, never realizing that he was just a moon reflecting the light I generated. Looking at my phone now, at Seorin's smug face in my penthouse, I realized my mistake. I had built a pedestal so high that he could no longer see the woman holding it up. But the foundation of his life wasn't made of his pride or his lineage. It was made of my code, my secrets, and my silence. And tonight, the silence was finally ending. The black sedan didn't move as I stepped back out into the freezing night, but the passenger door clicked open with a soft, inviting thud. I hesitated, the snow stinging my eyes, before the weight of the baby and the sheer exhaustion in my bones made the decision for me. I slid into the leather interior, the warmth of the car hitting me like a physical blow. The driver didn't speak. He simply pulled away from the curb, his gloved hands steady on the wheel as we navigated the labyrinth of Seoul's neon-lit backstreets. We didn't head toward the glittering high-rises or the familiar territories of the Foundation. Instead, the city began to grow grittier, the glass towers replaced by low-slung industrial brick and iron gate courtyards. We pulled up to an unmarked compound, shielded by high walls and ivy that had turned brittle in the frost. The gates buzzed open, revealing a hidden sanctuary that felt worlds away from the cold cruelty of the penthouse. The woman waiting for me in the foyer wasn't what I expected. She was older, her face a map of elegant resilience, with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe, professional knot. She wore a simple silk robe, but she carried herself with the authority of a general. She watched me struggle to stand, her eyes sweeping over my swollen ankles and the thin, inadequate coat I was clutching. "You're Kalisa," she said, her voice a low, resonant cello. It wasn't a question. "I've been expecting a call like this for a long time. Not from you, perhaps, but from whoever was next in line for Jin-Wook's particular brand of disposal." She stepped forward, taking my frozen hands in hers. Her grip was surprisingly warm. "I am Madame O. 10 years ago, I was the one who funded the Foundation's first real expansion. I was the one who gave Park Jin-Wook the capital to stop being a street thug and start being a king. And just like you, the moment he didn't need my money anymore, he decided I was a liability. He tried to have me erased. He didn't realize that some of us are harder to kill than others." I looked around the room, the monitors displaying silent security feeds, the quiet efficiency of the staff moving in the shadows. This wasn't a charity shelter. It was a fortress built on the wreckage of betrayal. "He thinks you're a victim, Kalisa. He thinks you're a placeholder who has reached her expiration date," Madame O continued, leading me toward a plush armchair near a crackling fire. "But I know who really wrote the code for his latest acquisition. I know who saved his life in Busan. You didn't just build his business, you built his armor. And now that he's stripped it off to be with that little socialite, he's never been more vulnerable." I sank into the chair, the heat finally reaching my core. For the first time since the foundation sign vanished in my rearview mirror, the baby stopped kicking frantically and settled. "He's playing a game he thinks he's already won," I whispered, looking into the flames. Madame O leaned in, a sharp, knowing glint in her eyes. "Then let's show him what happens when the architect decides to tear the building down. You have the keys, Kalisa. I have the locks. Shall we begin?" Warmth of Madame O's hearth was a sharp contrast to the cold calculation currently flowing through my fingertips. I sat with a sleek, unmarked laptop balanced precariously above the heavy curve of my belly, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. Madame O watched in silence, sipping tea as I entered the back doors I had built years ago, hidden corridors of code that Jin-Wook never knew existed. He thought he had revoked my access by freezing my bank cards, but he had only cut the surface wires. I was the one who owned the grid. I started small. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in before they actually collapsed. In the penthouse, the air conditioning unit suddenly groaned to life, dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling frost. Through the internal sensors, I could see the smart home system struggling to keep up as I overrode the thermostats. I watched the data spikes as Jin-Wook tried to adjust the settings from his phone, only for the interface to display a mocking, distorted version of our wedding photo. Next, I moved to the garage. The heavy, armored doors of his luxury SUV, the ones he used to protect himself from the world, suddenly slammed shut and deadlocked. I triggered the security alarms, a piercing, rhythmic wail that echoed through the underground parking structure, waking every neighbor in the high-rise. I could see his frantic attempts to disable the siren via his mobile app, but with every tap he made, I simply cycled the lights from red to blue, turning his status symbol into a chaotic disco ball of failure. The true satisfaction, however, came from the entertainment system. In the middle of their victory toast, the high-definition screens in every room flickered. The soft jazz Seoul had playing was replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very glass in her hand. Then, the audio switched to a loop of a recording he didn't know I had, the sound of him begging for my help 3 years ago during the Busan crisis. His voice, panicked and desperate, filled the luxury space he had just used to humiliate me. "Everything okay, Jin-Wook?" I whispered to the empty room, my fingers dancing over the keys. I moved into his primary business accounts. I didn't drain them, not yet. Instead, I set a glitch in the payroll system of the foundation. Every time a high-ranking lieutenant tried to access their holiday bonus, the transaction would redirect to a local women's shelter. He would spend the next several hours dealing with a mutiny of confused, angry soldiers, while his perfect night with Seoul dissolved into a nightmare of technical support calls that would never be answered. Madame O set her teacup down, a thin, predatory smile touching her lips. "He's calling his security chief now," she noted, glancing at a separate monitor. "Let him call," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the tears I had shed only hours ago. "He thinks he's fighting a ghost. He doesn't realize he's fighting the person who built the world he's standing in." I hit the final command for the night, a script that would rotate his passwords every 60 seconds, locking him out of his own life in a continuous, maddening loop. I closed the laptop and leaned back, feeling the baby settle into a quiet, rhythmic rest. For the first time in 5 years, the power wasn't in his hands. It was in mine, and I was just getting started. The grand hall of the Shilla was a cathedral of gold leaf and arrogance, teeming with the elite of the Foundation's world. From a hidden monitor in Madame O's command center, I watched the live feed of the annual winter gala. Jin-Wook looked the part of a king reclaimed, dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in a year. Beside him, Seoul was a vision in blood-red silk, her neck draped in diamonds that sparkled under the massive crystal chandeliers. They stood at the center of the room, receiving toasts and bows, the golden couple of a new era. I felt a sharp contraction, a reminder from my daughter that we were still in this fight. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Tonight was the night Jin-Wook wanted to announce his pure alliance to the elders, sealing his status and burying my existence forever. "The centerpiece of the evening," the master of ceremonies announced, gesturing to the massive 80-foot LED screen behind the podium. "A tribute to the visionary leadership of Chairman Park." Jin-Wook stepped forward, his chest out, a practiced humble smile on his face. He signaled for the video to begin. But as the lights dimmed, the celebratory music didn't play. Instead, a harsh, distorted screech filled the hall, making the socialites cover their ears. The screen flickered to life, but it wasn't a montage of his charitable works. It was a raw, high-definition dump of the Foundation's true ledger, the one I had maintained in the shadows. Names of corrupt officials, offshore routing numbers, and internal memos detailing his plan to liquidate the very elders currently sitting in the front row scrolled past at a readable pace. The room went deathly silent, the only sound the frantic clicking of Jin-Wook's remote as he tried to shut it down. Then the final blow. The screen transitioned to a hidden camera recording from the penthouse balcony only hours prior. It showed Jin-Wook laughing as he watched me walk into the snow, followed by his clear, cold voice caught on a hot mic. She was just the help, Seoul, a placeholder to build the bank. Now that the vault is full, the help is dismissed. The collective gasp was a physical wave. The elders, men who valued face and loyalty above all else, stood up as one. Their expressions shifted from confusion to murderous rage. They weren't just seeing a man who was cruel to his pregnant wife. They were seeing a man who had been plotting to steal their shares while calling them brothers. In the center of the chaos, Jin-Wook looked small. The red silk of Seorin's dress now looked like a target. She shrank back from him as the security detail, men I had once coded bonuses for, refused to move to his aid. He turned to the screen, his face pale and sweating, and for a fleeting second, he looked directly into the camera lens I had tapped. I leaned back into the shadows of the safe house, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. "Publicity is a double-edged sword, Jin-Wook," I whispered. "You wanted a face the elders could trust. Now they've seen yours." I closed the program as the feed showed the elders surrounding the podium. The Foundation was cracking, and the man who thought he could delete me was finally realizing that I was the only thing that had ever kept him whole. The aftermath of the gala was a slow-motion car crash that Jin-Wook was forced to watch from the driver's seat. Through the encrypted feed in Madame O's study, I watched the digital fallout paralyze the Foundation. It began as a series of frantic phone calls, but by dawn, it had evolved into a full-scale collapse. Jin-Wook sat in his darkened office, the city lights behind him no longer looking like jewels he owned, but like eyes watching him fail. He tried to initiate the emergency protocol, a system I had designed to wipe the servers and reset the ledgers in case of a raid. But as he typed his master override, the screen simply blinked a steady, rhythmic white, mirroring the heartbeat of the daughter he had discarded. I had locked the kernel. I had changed the architecture. He was tapping on a glass wall, unable to reach the power that had once made him untouchable. I watched him pick up his phone, his hand trembling as he dialed his head of it. "I don't care what it takes," he roared, his voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard. "Break the encryption. I need those accounts open before the elders freeze my assets at noon." There was a long pause as the voice on the other end delivered the news I already knew. The admin wasn't a set of codes. The admin was a ghost. Without my biometrics, without the specific sequence of keystrokes only I knew, the Foundation's wealth was effectively buried in a digital vault at the bottom of the ocean. He had the keys to the building, but I had the keys to the money. Jin-Wook slammed the phone down, sweeping the crystal decanter off his desk. The amber liquid sprayed across the floor, smelling of the same expensive sandalwood that had filled the penthouse when he kicked me out. He began packing the room, his eyes wild. He checked the desk drawers, the hidden safe, even the old files I had kept in the nursery closet. He was looking for a scrap of paper, a hint, a password, anything I might have left behind. But I had left nothing but a hollow space where a loyal wife used to be. He stopped in front of the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass. For the first time, the reality was setting in. He didn't know how to run the empire he claimed to rule. He didn't know the names of the secondary couriers. He didn't have the contact info for the silent partners in Singapore. He had spent 5 years being the face, while I was the brain, the blood, and the bone. Beside him, Seorin appeared in the doorway, her silk dress wrinkled, her triumph from the night before replaced by a sharp, calculating fear. "Jin-Wook, the lawyers are calling. They say the merger is on hold until we can prove the liquidity. He didn't answer her. He couldn't. He realized then that he hadn't just thrown away a pregnant woman, he had thrown away his engine. He was a pilot in a plane with no fuel, watching the ground rush up to meet him. "Find her," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling servers. "Find Kalisa. Tell her. Tell her there's been a mistake. Tell her I'll give her anything." I closed the laptop and looked at Madame O. She offered me a calm, steady nod. He was finally looking for me, but he wasn't looking for his wife. He was looking for his access, and that was the biggest mistake he'd made yet. The sanctuary of Madame O's estate was hushed. The only sound the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft hiss of the falling snow against the reinforced glass. But inside my room, the silence was shattered. The simmering stress of the betrayal, the freezing walk through the slush, and the high-octane digital warfare had finally pushed my body to its limit. The heavy, persistent ache in my back had sharpened into a white-hot iron brand, wrapping around my torso with a violence that stole my breath. I gripped the edge of the mahogany bedpost, my knuckles white, as the first true wave of labor crashed over me. In the high-rise penthouse, Jin-Wook was likely tearing the walls apart looking for his lost codes, but here, in the dim amber light of the safe house, I was facing a much older, more primal struggle. Madame O was at my side in an instant, her calm, steady hands anchoring me. She didn't call a public hospital. She didn't risk a paper trail that Jin-Wook's remaining loyalists could follow. Instead, a private team of midwives, women who owed their lives and their silence to the Madame, moved with clinical precision around me. Hours bled into a blur of sweat, shadows, and searing pain. Every contraction felt like the foundation of my own soul was being dismantled and rebuilt. In the moments between the waves, I thought of the way Jin-Wook had looked at Seoul while I stood in the cold. I thought of the invalid message on the ATM screen. Every memory of his cruelty became fuel. I wasn't just bringing a child into the world. I was forging a reason to finish what I had started. This child wouldn't be a pawn in a mafia legacy or a secret kept in the shadows. She would be the heir to everything I was about to take back. As the sun began to bleed a pale, winter gold over the horizon, a sharp, defiant cry filled the room. The sound was small, but it carried the strength of a thunderclap, vibrating through the very floorboards. The midwife placed a warm, heavy weight against my chest. "A girl," Madame O whispered, her severe face softening into something approaching pride. "A daughter for the new era." I looked down at the tiny, perfect face, the dark curls matted against her brow. She looked so much like the man who had discarded us, yet she was entirely mine. As her small hand curled around my finger, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over me. The last remnants of the woman who had pleaded for Jin-Wook's love died in that room. The wife who had cleaned his coffee rings and protected his ego was gone. I looked at Madame O, who was already holding my laptop. I didn't need to say a word. The exhaustion was there, but it was overshadowed by a terrifying, absolute resolve. Jin-Wook thought he had deleted me to make room for his future. He didn't realize that by giving me this child, he had given me the one thing I was willing to burn the entire world down to protect. "Is the server back up?" I asked, my voice rasping but steady as I held my daughter close. "Ready when you are," Madame O replied. I kissed the top of my baby's head. The foundation was currently a hollow shell, and it was time to start filling it with my own terms. The mercy I had felt for Jin-Wook's history was gone. From this moment on, every keystroke was for her. Every cent I recovered was her inheritance, and every tear I had shed in the snow would be paid back in blood and gold. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the serene, expensive quiet of a sanctuary. It had become the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Through the eyes of the hidden cameras I still controlled, I watched the reality of our shared history dissolve in real time. The amber glow of the chandeliers seemed dimmer, as if the very air was losing its value. Seoul stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. The white cashmere throw she had paraded on social media now slumped around her shoulders like a rag. She wasn't looking at the skyline with the eyes of a conqueror anymore. She was staring at her phone, her thumb frantically scrolling through the news of the Foundation's frozen assets. Jin-Wook sat at the mahogany desk, his head in his hands, the sharp charcoal overcoat I'd tailored for him discarded on the floor like a piece of trash. The jeweler called. Seorin's voice lacked its usual melodic silk. It was sharp, brittle, and edged with a growing disdain. They said the deposit for the necklace didn't clear. They're threatening to send the credit agency, Jin-Wook, my agency. Jin-Wook didn't look up. It's a glitch, Seorin, I told you. The servers are down. Kalisa did something, but my team will find the bypass by morning. Morning? She let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like glass breaking. She stepped toward him, but she didn't offer a hand of comfort. She stayed just out of reach, as if poverty were a contagious disease. The elders have already moved their security details out of the building. My father's assistants aren't answering my calls. They smell the blood in the water, Jin-Wook. They know you're locked out. I am the chairman, he roared, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot, the shadow of a beard darkening his jaw. He looked nothing like the untouchable boss she had signed up for. I built this, I am the foundation. You were the foundation because the money moved, she countered, her lip curling in a way that revealed the true depth of her loyalty. I didn't come back to you to be the wife of a man who can't even pay the electricity bill on his own tower. I came back for the power you promised. Without the access, you're just a man with a lot of enemies and a very expensive lease. She began to pace, her designer heels clicking irritably against the hardwood. I can't be seen with you like this. My brand, my family's reputation. We can't be tied to a sinking ship. If you don't have the codes by tonight, I'm moving my things to my sister's place in Gangnam. Jin-Wook stared at her, the shock of her betrayal mirroring the very look I must have worn on that snowy sidewalk. You're leaving, now, when everything is at stake. I'm protecting myself, she snapped, already reaching for her leather suitcase. Something you clearly don't know how to do. You told me she was just the help. Well, it seems the help took the house with her when she left. I watched from the safety of Madame O's estate, my daughter sleeping peacefully against my chest. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It was a cold, deep hum in my marrow. Jin-Wook had traded a woman who knew how to save his life for a woman who only knew how to spend his money. He was finally learning that when you build a kingdom on pride and placeholders, the first sign of a storm is all it takes for the walls to crumble from within. He was alone in his tower, and for the first time, he realized that Seorin hadn't fallen for him. She had fallen for the ghost of the wealth I had created. The transition of power didn't happen in a smoky basement or a back alley handoff. It happened in the clinical, high-tech silence of Madame O's conference room. The air was heavy with the scent of bitter tea and the cold weight of a dozen silenced weapons. Across the polished obsidian table sat the 3 remaining elders of the Foundation, men who had outlived empires by knowing exactly when to cut their losses. They looked at me, then at the sleeping infant in the bassinet beside my chair, and finally at the laptop screen that displayed the encrypted heartbeat of their entire fortune. I wasn't the temporary comfort Jin-Wook had described to them. I was the architect of their survival. Jin-Wook spent the night trying to hire a team of Russian hackers to break your wall, the eldest, Chairman Kang, said, his voice like gravel grinding together. They told him it would take 6 months and a miracle. We don't have 6 months. The authorities are circling, and our international partners are demanding the liquidity you've locked away. I leaned back, the physical exhaustion of motherhood replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. Jin-Wook thought he was the foundation, I said, my voice steady and cold. He thought the power was in the chair. He forgot that the chair only stays upright because I chose not to pull the legs out from under it. He pushed me into a snowstorm while I was carrying the next generation of this organization. He didn't just betray a wife, he betrayed the stability of your investments. The elders exchanged a glance. They were men of tradition, but they were, above all, men of profit. They had seen the footage from the gala. They had seen the way Seorin fled the moment the bank accounts turned to ice. They knew that a king without a treasury was just a target. We have spent the morning reviewing the digital logs, the second elder added, tapping a thick file. Every major expansion, every successful bypass of the tax authorities, every hidden asset, they all bear your digital signature. Jin-Wook was a loud voice, but you were the silent hand. The board has held an emergency vote. We are revoking his chairmanship effective immediately. He paused, sliding a heavy, gold-embossed document across the table toward me. We do not want a placeholder. We want the person who owns the code. We are offering you his seat, Kalisa, not as a wife, but as the director of the foundation. You keep the money moving, you keep the secrets buried, and we provide the muscle to ensure you and that child are never touched again. I looked down at the document. It was more than a job offer. It was a total role reversal. By signing this, I wouldn't just be taking his house and his money. I would be taking his name, his legacy, and his future. I would be the one standing in the warm light of the penthouse, and he would be the one left in the cold. And Jin-Wook? I asked, my thumb tracing the edge of the paper. He is a liability now, Chairman Kang replied. A man who loses his mind over a mistress is a man who cannot be trusted with an empire. We will leave his fate to his landlord. I picked up the fountain pen, the same gold one I had bought for him years ago, which Madame O had recovered from the penthouse office. I signed my name in a sharp, decisive stroke. The help was officially taking over the house. The legal mechanisms of high finance were far more efficient than any mafia hit, and much colder. I sat in Madame O's study. The rhythmic breathing of my daughter against my chest, providing the only warmth in a room filled with the blue light of foreclosure documents and debt acquisition files. While Jin-Wook had spent his final days in the penthouse, desperately trying to sell off his private assets to cover his mounting legal fees, I had been working with the elders to consolidate his ruin. Through a shell corporation I had named the Phoenix Foundation, I began systematically purchasing his personal liabilities. I bought the predatory loans he'd taken out in a panic to pay off the Russian hackers. I bought the defaulted mortgage on the penthouse, the very home he had kicked me out of. I even bought the outstanding lease on the luxury SUV that was currently deadlocked in his garage. By noon, I didn't just own his business. I owned the bed he slept in and the roof over his head. I watched through the penthouse's security feed as a pair of men in dark suits, my men now, delivered the physical eviction notice. Jin-Wook opened the door, looking skeletal, his eyes sunken and his expensive silk shirt stained with the sweat of a man who hadn't slept in a week. He grabbed the papers, his hands shaking as he read the name of the new lien holder. He looked at the camera lens in the hallway, his mouth falling open. He knew that name. He knew the coding signature on the digital filing. I didn't wait for him to process the shock. I picked up the VoIP phone, routing the call through the penthouse's internal speaker system. My voice echoed through the marble halls he had once paced as a king. "The locks change at sunset, Jin-Wook," I said, my tone as flat and biting as the Seoul wind. "I checked the inventory. You're behind on the property taxes, the utility payments, and the maintenance fees. As your new landlord, I'm afraid I find you to be an unreliable tenant. You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry. Sound familiar?" I heard a muffled sob from the other end, not a sound of remorse, but the sound of a man who had finally realized he was small. There was no Seorin to comfort him. She had cleared out her jewelry boxes days ago. There were no loyal guards to protect him. They were currently downstairs wearing Phoenix insignias. "Kalisa," he choked out, leaning against the wall for support. "Please, I have nowhere to go. My accounts are still locked. I don't have a cent." "I know," I replied, looking down at my daughter's perfect, tiny hand. "I'm the one who locked them. You told me I was a placeholder, Jin-Wook. You told me the help was dismissed. Well, the help is now the owner, and I don't keep liabilities on my books." I cut the connection before he could beg. I didn't need to hear his excuses or his apologies. They were as empty as the promises he had made me for 5 years. I watched on the screen as he stumbled out into the hallway, clutching a single tattered duffel bag, the same way I had left but without the dignity of carrying a life within him. As the elevator doors closed on his shattered expression, I felt a final, heavy weight lift from my shoulders. The foreclosure was complete. The house was mine. And the man who had tried to delete me was now nothing more than a ghost in his own hallway. The slush on the driveway of Madame O's estate crunched under the weight of a man who had lost everything but his desperation. Through the high-resolution security monitors, I watched Jin-Wook approach the iron gates. He was unrecognizable from the titan who had pushed me into the snow weeks ago. His designer clothes were wrinkled and salt-stained, his posture broken, and his eyes darted around with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. He had spent his last few won on a taxi to follow a lead he thought was a secret, never realizing I had let him find me. I wanted him to see. I stepped out onto the wide stone portico, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a solid final thud. I was draped in a floor-length coat of midnight wool, my daughter secured in a silken wrap against my chest. The winter air was biting, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. The fire of my new reality kept me insulated. "Kalisa," he screamed, his voice cracking as he reached the perimeter of the courtyard. He tried to lung forward, but he stopped dead in his tracks. From the shadows of the stone pillars and the frost-covered hedges, 6 men stepped forward in perfect, lethal synchronization. Jin-Wook's breath hitched. These weren't strangers. These were his iron guard, the elite security detail that had stood behind him during every board meeting and every territorial dispute for years. They were the men he had bragged were loyal only to the Park bloodline. Now they stood in a semicircle around me, their hands on their holsters, their expressions as cold and unyielding as the frozen ground. "Step back, Jin-Wook," said Min-ho, the lead guard who had once driven Jin-Wook to the gala where I was humiliated. His voice held no recognition, only a professional warning. "Min-ho, what are you doing?" Jin-Wook gasped, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "I'm your chairman. I'm the one who signed your contracts." "Actually," I intervened, my voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I'm the one who funded the pension accounts you tried to raid last week. I'm the one who ensured their families were moved to safe zones when the elders turned on you. They don't work for a name, Jin-Wook. They work for the person who keeps their world stable, and that person isn't you." Jin-Wook looked at the men, then back at me, his face contorting in a mix of rage and agonizing grief. He saw the way they stood, shoulders squared toward me, eyes scanning the perimeter for my safety. I was no longer the placeholder hidden in his penthouse. I was the center of the gravity he had lost. "I made a mistake," he sobbed, dropping to his knees in the dirty slush. "The ex, Seorin, she's gone. She took the remaining cash and left for Paris. Kalisa, please, for the baby, let me in. I can help you run the foundation. You need a face the world knows." I looked down at him from the top of the stairs, feeling a strange, hollow pity. "The world already knows your face, Jin-Wook. They saw it on the screen at the Shilla. They saw a man who discards his family for a whim." I adjusted the wrap around my daughter, who slept through the entire confrontation. "You're right about one thing, though. You were a face. But I was the one who gave that face a reason to be feared. And now, I think I'll just let you be a memory." I turned my back on him, signaling the guards. As the heavy doors opened to welcome me back into the warmth, the last thing I heard was the sound of my former husband being escorted back to the gate, a man who had finally realized that the help hadn't just taken his house, she had taken his soul. The sun had begun to set over the city, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the lobby of the newly rebranded Phoenix Tower. I stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the expansive marble floor I had once helped pay for, but which now legally belonged to my daughter's trust. The air was pressurized and cool, smelling of expensive lilies and the ozone of high-end security systems. A side door opened, and a man was led in by 2 of my security detail. He wasn't handcuffed, but he moved as if he were carrying the weight of the entire building on his shoulders. Jin-Wook looked up, his eyes squinting against the brilliance of the chandeliers. He had spent the last week in a state-run shelter, his face no longer gracing the covers of business journals, but instead appearing in the wanted for questioning scrolls of local news. He looked at me, standing above him, and for the first time in our lives, he looked small. "You said you had a proposal," he croaked, his voice thin. "The lawyers said if I came here, you might help me with the deportation stay. I have nowhere to go, Kalisa. No one will hire a man associated with the Foundation's collapse." I descended the stairs slowly, each click of my heels echoing like a heartbeat in the cavernous space. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of him. I could see the frayed edges of his collar, the same one I used to starch with such care. "I'm a businesswoman now, Jin-Wook," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I don't believe in handouts, but I do believe in giving people exactly what they've earned. You told me that I was the help." You told me that my place was in the background, keeping the foundation clean while you enjoyed the view. I signaled to one of the staff, who stepped forward holding a heavy industrial bucket and a mop. The metallic clatter as they hit the marble floor was the loudest sound in the room. I have an opening for a maintenance technician, I continued, watching as his face turned a deep, humiliated crimson. The hours are long, the work is invisible. And the pay is just enough to keep you in a one-bedroom flat in the district you once looked down upon. You'll be responsible for the lobby, the elevators, and the trash chutes. It's a temporary position, of course, just like you said I was. He stared at the mop, then at the guards who were once his shadows, and finally at me. The pride that had once been his armor was now a jagged glass shard in his throat. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gripped the wooden handle of the mop. "Do I start tonight?" he whispered, his head bowed. "Tonight," I replied, turning away to head back to the elevators that would take me to the top floor. "And Jin-Wook, make sure the glass is clear. I'd hate for anything to obscure the view from my office." As the elevator doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was the man who had tried to delete me, dropping to his knees to scrub a scuff mark off the floor of the empire I now ruled. The reversal was absolute. He was finally the foundation of my building, but not in the way he had ever imagined. The penthouse was silent now, save for the soft, rhythmic puff of my daughter's breath against my neck. The air inside no longer smelled of Jin-Wook's sandalwood or the sharp, metallic tang of betrayal. It smelled of fresh lilies and the clean, cold scent of the winter sky. I stepped through the heavy glass doors onto the balcony, the very spot where Seoul had stood in her borrowed cashmere, believing she had conquered a kingdom she didn't understand. The wind was still there, biting and relentless, but it no longer felt like a predator hunting me. It felt like an acknowledgement. Below, Seoul was a sprawling tapestry of neon and shadow, a grid of light that pulsed with the data I had mastered. From this height, the cars were merely specks and the people were invisible, but I knew exactly where each thread of power led. I could see the glowing logo of the Phoenix Tower, and further down, the shadowed streets where a man was currently mopping floors, learning the true cost of the foundation he had taken for granted. I shifted the weight of my daughter, tucking her more deeply into the warmth of my wool coat. She was the only legacy that mattered now. She would grow up in the rooms where I had once been a secret, but she would walk through them as the owner. She would never know the sting of being a placeholder or the cold of an alleyway, because I had turned my heartbreak into an armor that covered the entire city. A single snowflake drifted down, landing on my hand. I didn't brush it away. I watched it melt against my skin, a tiny, fleeting reminder of the night I was deleted. Jin-Wook had thought he was casting me out into the void, never realizing that the void was where I did my best work. He had tried to break me, but he had only succeeded in stripping away everything that wasn't essential, leaving behind a woman who was no longer afraid of the dark. I looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to crack the sky with a sliver of defiant gold. The elders were silent. The rivals were subdued. The accounts were full. I wasn't just the secret weapon anymore, and I wasn't just the mother of an heir. I was the architect who had survived the demolition of her own life and built something indestructible in its place. "Look at it, Maya," I whispered into the soft curve of my daughter's ear as the city lights flickered in the transition from night to day. "It's all yours, and this time, no one is going to tell us we don't belong." I stood there for a long time, a queen in the cold, watching the sun rise over a world that finally knew my name. The snow continued to fall, but the frost was gone. The winter had ended, and the era of the Phoenix had begun. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please like and subscribe to see more stories like this. See you in my next video.